So let's start tonight with something that, on the surface, does not make sense. A war entering its fourth year. A Russia exhausted by casualties, by sanctions, by a military machine devouring its own future. A Ukraine hanging on by determination, by Western weapons, by a kind of national resilience that no intelligence agency in the world predicted back in February 2022. And an American president, one famously eager to make deals, offering Vladimir Putin what, by any historical standard, would qualify as the most generous peace terms ever extended to an invading aggressor who has not won the war he started. Recognition of occupied territories, Ukraine's NATO door effectively shut, Europe pushed into accepting a frozen conflict they absolutely do not want, and Washington stepping back from its traditional security role in Europe. If you were Vladimir Putin, after thousands of tanks lost, after mass mobilization, after over 1 million casualties across all categories, wouldn't you at least consider a deal like that? Wouldn't any rational leader pause and think, all right, maybe this is my exit ramp. Maybe I can declare victory, take what I've carved out, and stop the bleeding? Well, apparently not. Because the one person who does not seem remotely interested in any form of peace, even one stacked wildly in his favor, is Vladimir Putin himself. And that is where tonight's story begins. Not with what Russia says publicly, not with the propaganda, not with the speeches about NATO expansion or denazification, but with the simple, stubborn, uncomfortable question that sits underneath every headline coming out of this war right now. Why does Vladimir Putin refuse peace, even when peace looks like victory for him? And look, I know that question has been asked before, on cable news, in think tanks, in op-ed pages, and the easy answers are always the same. He's irrational. He's obsessed with Ukraine. He's isolated. He doesn't understand the ground truth. But the more you dig into the data, the casualty figures, the annexations, the economic budgets, the intelligence leaks, the behavior of China, even the internal purges within Russia's own political circles, the more you begin to understand something that is both simple and deeply unsettling. Putin doesn't refuse peace despite the costs of the war. He refuses peace because of what peace would expose. Asterisk. And the story gets even stranger. Because it's not one reason. It's not a single ideology or a single grievance. It's a whole ecosystem that has grown around this war. Political, economic, psychological, even personal, and every piece of it pushes in the same direction. Toward continuation of the conflict, not toward ending it. So tonight, in this first block, I want to set the stage for what we are actually dealing with. Because this is not a story about a war that spiraled out of control. This is a story about a leader who needs this war to maintain control. And the first clue, the first crack in the official narrative appears when you look at what Putin actually wanted in February 2022. He did not invade Ukraine to protect Russian speakers. He did not invade to keep NATO away. He did not invade to secure Crimea or liberate Donbass. If those had been the goals, this war would have ended years ago. He could have claimed victory, signed papers, walked away. But what did he do instead? He sent columns of tanks straight toward Kyiv. He tried to decapitate the Ukrainian government. He tried very openly to install a puppet regime. That's not a man fighting for buffer zones. That's a man trying to erase a country. And even after that failed, after Ukraine survived, after Russian troops were pushed back from the north, after the whole world saw that Kyiv wasn't going to fall, Putin did something extraordinary. He doubled down. He annexed 4 Ukrainian regions, not recognizing them as disputed, not as temporarily controlled, but as forever part of Russia. Forever. His word. It was the largest forcible annexation of territory in Europe since World War II, and he did it at a moment when Russian forces did not even control the totality of the land he claimed. You don't annex land forever because you're looking for an exit ramp. You annex land forever because your goal is not stability, it's domination. And still, that's not the whole picture. Because even if you assume Putin is an imperialist, which he is, that alone does not explain the timing. It doesn't explain why he wouldn't take an easy win now, declare mission accomplished, consolidate what he holds, regroup, and rebuild. To understand that part, the refusal of peace, even when victory is being handed to him, you have to zoom out. You have to look at the 4 forces that are trapping him inside this war. Not excuses, not talking points, structural realities. Force number 1, A democratic, thriving, European Ukraine is an existential threat to Putin's regime, not to Russia, to Putin's regime, to the system of oligarchs, security services, propaganda, and political repression that keeps him in power. A Ukraine that reforms, that grows economically, that joins the European Union and becomes a success story that is a living, breathing counterexample to everything Putin tells his own people about how Western-style democracy only brings chaos. If Ukraine proves him wrong, the whole narrative collapses. And he knows that. Force number two, Russia's economy has become so militarized, so distorted, so dependent on war spending that peace would be economically destabilizing. Factories producing tanks 24/7, that's not growth, that's war dependency. When almost half of your federal budget is defense 40% by next year. Peace doesn't feel like relief. It feels like a cliff. Force number three, the internal political system purges, paranoia, loyalty tests. The whole apparatus is built to survive under conditions of emergency. Peace removes the emergency. And when the emergency disappears, accountability appears. That's not theory. We just saw it with a minister who was fired in the morning and found dead by afternoon. In Russia's elite circles, peace isn't stability. Peace is danger. Force number four, China. China does not want a Trump-brokered peace that gives the U.S. a diplomatic victory. China needs Russia locked into a long war so it stays dependent economically, technologically, politically. Putin cannot ignore Beijing's leverage. And that is the part Donald Trump apparently has not understood. Not even the American president can broker peace if the man on the other side needs the war more than the peace. So as we begin tonight, as we step into the deeper layers of this story in the next blocks, I want you to keep one thing in focus. This is not a stalemate waiting for compromise. This is not two sides looking for the least painful way out. This is a war sustained by the internal logic of an autocracy that cannot survive what comes after. And if we do not understand that, if we keep treating this as a negotiation failure or a diplomatic mismatch or a personality clash between world leaders, then we misunderstand the entire trajectory of the conflict. Because at its core, this is the truth. Putin does not want peace. Putin cannot afford peace. And until something inside Russia breaks militarily, economically, politically, he will keep choosing war, no matter how much it costs his country, his people, or the world around him. So, once you start pulling at the threads of this war, you realize something that is both obvious and unsettling. From the very beginning, Vladimir Putin was never fighting for Donbass. He wasn't fighting for Luhansk. He wasn't fighting for a sliver of territory along the eastern edge of Ukraine. He was fighting for Ukraine itself. Not part of it, not some of it, all of it. And if that sounds like an exaggeration, it isn't. It comes straight from Putin's own mouth. At a major economic forum in St. Petersburg, in front of the world's business leaders, officials, and media, he said very plainly that Russians and Ukrainians were one people. And that, in his view, all of Ukraine is ours. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. It was the quiet part said out loud. And it exposed the real goal of this war, the one that was never about liberation or security or ethnic Russians. It was about absorption, erasure, the undoing of a sovereign nation. To understand why peace is impossible for Putin, you have to understand this ambition. Because a leader who believes another country belongs to him does not negotiate borders. He redraws them by force if necessary. And Russia's first moves in February 2022 prove that point more clearly than any speech ever could. Consider where the invasion began. If Putin wanted Donbass, then a massive incursion from the north, from Belarus, straight toward Kyiv, makes no sense. You don't send armored columns toward a capital city if your goal is simply to protect Russian-speaking regions. You don't drop airborne units near Hostomel Airport in the first hours of the war unless you're trying to topple the government. Those were not defensive moves. They were regime change moves. And regime change is not something you attempt unless you envision taking control of the whole state. Even after the failure of that first blitz, when Russian forces were pushed back from Kyiv, from Chernihiv, from Sumy, Putin did not reconsider the scale of his ambition. He did the opposite. He doubled down. He annexed 4 regions: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Donetsk, declaring them to be part of Russia forever. It was the largest forcible annexation of territory in Europe since World War II. And in a detail that should make everyone stop and think, Russia did not even fully control those territories at the time. Parts were still held by Ukrainian forces. Parts were actively being contested. Think about the audacity of that. Annexing land you do not fully control is not the behavior of a leader preparing to negotiate. It is the behavior of a leader announcing in the bluntest possible terms that compromise is not an option. Now, if annexing those regions was the end of the story, you could maybe argue that Putin wanted a buffer or some form of territorial leverage. But even that explanation collapses quickly once you examine the military patterns. Russian forces didn't just push from the east. They came from the north, the northeast, and the south. They attacked Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, and Kyiv. They wanted the entire Black Sea coastline. They tried to cut Ukraine off from the west. They tried to collapse the political system from the inside. That is not a regional war. That is a full state war. The model Putin clearly had in mind was not the Soviet model and not even the Imperial Russian model. It was the Belarus model. A country that technically exists, has a president, an anthem, and a seat at the United Nations, but in practice functions as an extension of the Kremlin, a satellite, a puppet state, a territory whose every major decision radiates outward from Moscow. That was and still is the desired outcome for Ukraine. This is why analysts at the Jacques Delors Institute warned early in the war that Putin's interest in Donbass was superficial. Economically, the region is devastated. Militarily, it does not offer decisive advantage. Strategically, it is a stepping stone, not a destination. What he wants is control over the entire Ukrainian state and the ability to dictate its future direction. The Belarusianization of Ukraine is not a metaphor. It is his stated objective. And achieving that objective is incompatible with any form of peace, not because Ukraine refuses to negotiate, not because NATO is forcing escalation, but because peace preserves Ukrainian sovereignty. And preserving Ukraine as an independent, democratic, Western-aligned nation is the one thing Putin cannot allow. If Ukraine survives as a functioning democracy, it becomes everything Putin fears inside Russia, a living counterexample. A Slavic post-Soviet nation that integrates with Europe, that fights corruption, that grows economically, that modernizes its institutions, and that shows the Russian people a different path, a freer path. That is the nightmare scenario for an autocrat who stays in power by convincing his citizens that democracy leads to chaos. If Ukraine proves him wrong, his system cracks at the core. So yes, it makes perfect sense that Putin rejects peace agreements that would, on paper, give him huge concessions, because those agreements would force him to accept a future in which Ukraine still exists. And for him, that alone is a defeat. There is another layer to this, though, a practical one, a strategic one. As long as the war continues, the map is fluid, borders are negotiable. Facts can be created on the ground. But the moment the war stops, every line becomes fixed. Every concession becomes permanent. Every failure becomes obvious. War offers ambiguity. Peace offers clarity. And clarity is what Putin cannot afford. Because clarity reveals something else, that after 3 years of war, Russia has taken catastrophic losses, over 1 million casualties across all categories. Entire units destroyed, generals dismissed or killed, veterans returning home with trauma, illness, addiction, and no path back to civilian life. Mobilization that has strained regions economically and demographically. In a world where peace happens, all of those facts come to the surface. In a world with war, they can be buried under the language of advances, momentum, and turning points. Peace is accountability. War is a cover, and the Kremlin has made its choice. It chooses war because war protects the myth of Russian power, the myth of strategic genius, the myth of a president in control of history not being crushed by it. And now, as we go deeper into this narrative, we reach the most dangerous part of the equation, the place where ambition meets delusion, the place where the lies being fed to Putin by his officials matter just as much as the lies being fed to the Russian public. Because if you want to understand why Putin still believes total conquest is achievable, you have to follow the information chain. You have to see who is telling him what and why. And that brings us directly into the next block. So now that we've established that Vladimir Putin's ambitions go far beyond the Donbass, and that peace would fundamentally contradict everything he is trying to achieve, we have to look at something even more disturbing. Because ambition alone doesn't sustain a war for this long. Not with this level of casualties. Not with this level of economic strain. Not with this level of internal decay. To sustain a war like this, you need something else. You need a system that reinforces the delusion. You need people around the leader who tell him that everything is fine, that progress is being made, that Ukrainian resistance is collapsing, that the economy is resilient, that the world is secretly on Russia's side. You need a lie, a big one, a structural one. And in today's Russia, that lie comes from an ecosystem built around fear. A system in which telling the truth to the president has become so dangerous, so professionally suicidal, that even the most senior officials will distort reality rather than risk his anger. This is what autocracies do. They hollow themselves out from the inside. They replace information with loyalty. They turn reporting into flattery. And they turn intelligence into storytelling. If you want a perfect, tragic example of how this works, you don't have to look back to Stalin. You can look at something that happened this year, the death of Roman Starovoyt. Think about this story for a moment. A minister, a federal minister, fired in the morning by presidential decree, found dead by the afternoon with a gunshot wound to the head, a pistol left at the scene, and investigators immediately suggesting suicide. No trial, no charges, no public explanation, just gone. And the silence that followed was even louder. On state television, the Kremlin's most powerful tool for shaping public perception, the entire incident received 18 seconds of coverage, not 18 minutes. 18 seconds. Mentioned in passing, no context, no follow-up, no questions, nothing. Meanwhile, every major Russian newspaper was filled with speculation. Speculation about corruption charges, speculation about failures in the Kursk defenses, speculation about whether he feared prison, retribution, humiliation. But the real lesson was not about Starovoyt, it was about the system. The message to the political elite was unmistakable. When you fall out of favor, there is no safety net. When you fail, there is no forgiveness. When you lose the president's trust or simply embarrass him, the consequences are immediate, irreversible, and potentially lethal. And in an environment like that, how do you think officials report bad news? How do you walk into a briefing room and tell Vladimir Putin that half of the 41st Army has collapsed? How do you tell him that over 1 million Russian soldiers are dead, wounded, missing, or captured? How do you tell him that units are deserting, that fortifications are failing, that mobilized troops are untrained and unprepared, that Ukraine has retaken towns Russia claimed to control, that Western sanctions are working slowly but relentlessly? You don't. Not if you value your career. Not if you value your freedom. Not if you value your life. Instead, you tell him what he wants to hear. You paint the picture he prefers. You give him a version of the war in which Russia is always on the verge of a breakthrough, always advancing, always making progress somewhere along the line of contact. And that is exactly what has been happening. Let's talk about General Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff. This is the man responsible for briefing Putin directly on the state of the war. And the pattern is unmistakable. He routinely walks into meetings and announces sweeping victories. Entire Ukrainian formations supposedly encircled, towns claimed to be captured, advances described as decisive, breakthroughs depicted as imminent. And yet, every time, independent analysts, including the Institute for the Study of War, review satellite footage, field reports, geolocated videos, and frontline data, and they find nothing. No encirclements. No breakthroughs, no massive advances, just small positional gains, heavy losses, stagnation, exhaustion. In one briefing, Gerasimov claimed that Russian forces had seized more than 70% of Vovchansk. The actual figure, confirmed by multiple sources, was closer to 23%. 23%, a fraction, nowhere near 70. But here's the part that should really make us stop. Even Russian pro-war military bloggers, people who support the invasion, who want Russia to win, openly mocked the claim. They called it fiction. They said the situation on the ground was chaos. They pointed out that Russian units were, in some cases, still losing ground. So why would Gerasimov present such inflated reports? Because inside the Kremlin, accuracy is not rewarded. Loyalty is. Optimism is. Obedience is. If Putin wants to believe the war is turning in his favor, it becomes the job of those around him to construct that belief. To build it out of misleading statistics, selective information, exaggerated victories, and outright fabrications. This is why Putin, even now, appears convinced that Ukraine is collapsing. This is why he publicly insists that every Russian casualty died for a cause. This is why he corrects allies like Lukashenko when they describe Russian gains as capturing territory. Putin insists the forces are returning it as if these regions were always Russia's. He is not just spinning a narrative for the public, he is building a reality for himself. And once a leader begins to govern from inside an alternate reality, the dangers multiply. Because delusion at the highest levels of power becomes strategic. It shapes decisions. It shapes military orders. It shapes negotiations. It shapes the very question of whether peace is possible. When you believe you are winning, why would you stop? When your generals tell you victory is approaching, why negotiate? When your intelligence services hide the extent of the economic collapse, why compromise? And this deception isn't limited to military reports. It extends to the economy. Putin is told that Russia is withstanding sanctions, that the country is more resilient than the West, that the economy is growing, that oil revenues are stable, that industries are thriving. And yes, on paper, statistics can be manipulated to create the illusion of growth. Factories can run around the clock producing tanks, drones, and ammunition. But war production does not equal prosperity, it equals dependency. Yet the technocrats who manage Russia's economy have every incentive to conceal the long-term decay, the labor shortages, the high inflation, the shortage of skilled workers, the structural damage caused by militarization, and the rising cost of Chinese imports. Because telling the truth in this system is dangerous. And this brings us to the heart of the matter. Putin rejects peace deals not because they are bad deals. He rejects them because he believes he is winning. Not because he is winning, because he believes he is. And that belief is the product of a system designed to keep him misinformed. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining circle of delusion. A government built on fear, where every failure becomes somebody else's death sentence and every report becomes a performance. Peace cannot emerge from a system like that. Rational decision-making cannot emerge from a system like that. A realistic assessment of the war cannot emerge from a system like that. And until that system breaks, nothing else will. So, if the inner circle around Vladimir Putin sustains the war through delusion, we now have to look at the other pillar that keeps the invasion alive. Because wars are not powered only by ideas. They are powered by money, by production, by factories, by budgets, by labor, by the entire machinery of the state. And right now, Russia's entire economy has been reshaped not to live, not to grow, not to modernize, but to wage war. Let's pause on that for a moment. This is the first time since the Cold War that a major world economy has moved so decisively into a war footing. Not metaphorically, not rhetorically, literally, structurally. At every level of state spending, industrial output, labor allocation, and technological capacity. In 2024, Russia spent roughly a third of its national budget on the military. In 2025, that number will hit 40%. 40%. 4 out of every 10 rubles spent by the government will go directly to the war effort. That is not sustainable for a modern country. It is not normal. It is not compatible with peacetime. It is a sign of a state that has reorganized itself around a single objective: survival through conflict. But here's the most important part. This transformation makes peace almost impossible. Because a country that has redesigned its economic life around war is a country that cannot easily stop the war without triggering an internal collapse. Russia today is not only fighting a war, the war has become the thing keeping the economy afloat. Let's break this down. Across Russia, military factories are operating around the clock. Artillery production is up 50-fold. Armored vehicle output has multiplied several times. Drone manufacturing has exploded. This is all being reported proudly by Russian defense firms as if industrial overdrive were a sign of strength rather than desperation. But here's the uncomfortable truth. An economy that grows because it is building things meant to be destroyed is not actually growing. It is cannibalizing itself. Every tank produced is a tank that will be blown up. Every shell manufactured is a shell that will be fired and vanish. Every drone delivered is a single-use expenditure. The resources used for that production, steel, electronics, engines, labor, do not build a future. They build a graveyard. And that is why economists inside and outside Russia are sounding the alarm. Because Russia's so-called growth comes almost entirely from low-tech war manufacturing that adds nothing to the country's long-term development. It is essentially digging economic holes just to fill them again. But the more Russia commits to this model, the harder it becomes to reverse. Now, add sanctions to this picture. Western sanctions have not collapsed Russia. Not yet. But they are eroding it from underneath. Russia is compensating by buying enormous quantities of technology from China, South Korea, Taiwan, everything. From CNC machines to guidance components to microchips. But it has to pay a premium. 78% more for certain Chinese imports compared to pre-war levels. This is not a sustainable equilibrium. This is economic triage. Meanwhile, skilled labor is disappearing. Hundreds of thousands of professionals have left Russia. Tens of thousands more have been killed in Ukraine or mobilized. Industries report worker shortages across the board. 80% of Russian companies cannot find the staff they need. Inflation is rising again. The central bank is hiking interest rates at a pace reminiscent of past financial crises. Consumer borrowing is soaring. And real wages are being quietly eroded by the cost of war. So what does the Kremlin do? It throws money at soldiers. It throws money at their families. It throws money at defense contractors. Cash injections, subsidies, bonuses, anything to keep the war economy running for one more month, one more quarter, one more year. But those injections fuel inflation. Inflation forces interest rates higher. High interest rates cripple the real economy, which is already starved of labor and dependent on expensive imports. And that makes Russia even more dependent on war manufacturing as the only functioning economic engine left. This is what economists refer to as an autocratic doom loop. War sustains the economy. The economy sustains the war. Stopping either collapses the other. It is a trap of their own making. Now, let's add one more layer. Russia cannot fix these structural problems while Putin remains in power. Why? Because fixing them would require reducing military spending, lowering mobilization levels, reopening the country, rebuilding the civilian economy, and reestablishing foreign investment, all of which would only be possible after a peace deal. But a peace deal would expose the reality of the war, that Russia did not achieve its goals, that victory was an illusion, that the losses were catastrophic, that the country paid a generational price for an imperial fantasy. Putin cannot politically survive that moment. And so the war continues, not because it is winnable, but because the alternative is worse for the regime. So let's put this plainly. Russia's economy cannot afford peace. Its leadership cannot politically survive peace. And its war machine cannot be turned off without revealing the extent of the damage it has caused. This is why the Kremlin rejects ceasefires. This is why it inflates battlefield success. This is why it dedicates nearly half its budget to the military. This is why it increases classified spending every year. This is why it floods propaganda channels with the message that Russia is somehow stronger than ever. Because peace is destabilizing. Because truth is destabilizing. Because transparency is destabilizing. And that is why the war continues. So if we've established that Russia's economy is now structurally dependent on the war, we have to examine something just as important and just as revealing what the war is doing inside Russia. Not in the abstract, not as a geopolitical headline, but inside the political system, inside the ministries, inside the minds of the people who serve this government. Because one of the most striking patterns of the last 3 years is not only that Russia cannot afford peace economically, it's that many of the people around Vladimir Putin cannot survive peace politically or personally. And nothing illustrates this better than what happened in Moscow just a few months ago. A minister was fired in the morning. By the afternoon, he was dead. A pistol on the ground beside his body. A single gunshot wound. His name was Roman Starovoyt. Until that morning, he was Russia's Minister of Transport. Hours after President Putin publicly dismissed him, his body was found in a park on the edge of the capital. Investigators quickly called it a suicide. Russian newspapers called it unprecedented. You have to go back more than 30 years to the final days of the Soviet Union to find a similar case, the suicide of the interior minister during the failed 1991 coup. And yet here we are again. Now, the Kremlin, of course, refused to say much. Putin's spokesman said they were shocked and insisted that speculation should be left to the media. But Russian journalists did speculate, and not without reason, because before becoming transport minister, Starovoyt had been governor of Kursk, a region that borders Ukraine. Under his leadership, vast sums of money had been allocated to build fortifications across the border, yet those defenses failed. Ukrainian troops broke through in 2024. Territory was lost. And after the invasion stalled, arrests began. The new governor was detained. His deputy was detained. Charges of massive fraud, corruption tied to those very same fortifications. Russian newspapers, including Kommersant, suggested that Starovoyt himself might soon be implicated. Now imagine that for a moment. You are a senior official in a system that has become increasingly punitive, increasingly opaque, increasingly paranoid. You have seen colleagues arrested, humiliated, charged with treason, corruption, or sabotage. You know what happens to people who fall out of favor. You know what happens to people who are blamed for failures that the Kremlin itself cannot admit publicly. You also know there is no safe exit, no resignation, no retirement, no graceful way to step aside. And so Roman Starovoyt is fired in the morning. By afternoon, he is gone. We cannot know with certainty what drove him to that moment, but we do know what Nina Khrushcheva, a respected scholar of Russian politics and the great-granddaughter of former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, said afterward. She said it reminded her of 1937, of Stalin's purges, of ministers who saw no way out. And whether we accept that comparison literally or metaphorically, the message it sends to Russia's political elite is unmistakable. There is no safe way to fall. There is no soft landing. The system does not forgive failure, and it certainly does not forgive the perception of weakness. Even more telling is how state television handled the event. The largest news show in Russia devoted 4 full minutes to introducing the replacement minister. They did not mention that the previous minister had been fired. They did not mention he had died. Only 40 minutes later, in a brief 18-second segment, did the anchor casually mention the death, and even then, with no context, no analysis, and no sense of gravity. Most Russians watching would not have realized anything unusual had occurred at all. So let's pause there. When a senior minister dies by gunshot hours after being dismissed, when the government pretends nothing happened on national television, when political elites interpret the death as a warning, that is not normal. That is not stable. That is not the behavior of a government confident about the future. Now, connect that to the broader pattern. Over the past 3 years, governors have been arrested, generals have disappeared, intelligence officers have been purged. Business leaders have died in mysterious circumstances, falls from windows, sudden illness, unexplained accidents. And in the shadows, a new culture of fear has taken root. This matters because a frightened elite does not negotiate peace. A frightened elite does not tell the leader he is losing. A frightened elite does not risk advocating restraint, compromise, or de-escalation. A frightened elite chooses loyalty, even when the war is failing, even when the cost is unbearable, even when the truth is obvious. Meanwhile, inside Russia, something else is happening that complicates any path to peace. The return of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, some wounded, some disfigured, some traumatized, some radicalized, some angry. Some addicted to alcohol, painkillers, or violence. Some unable to reintegrate into civilian life after years on the front. These men have been paid far more than they could ever earn in civilian jobs. Their families depend on wartime paychecks. Entire towns now rely on the incomes of men fighting in Ukraine. If the war stops, that income stops. If mobilization ends, those benefits end. If peace arrives, tens of thousands of veterans return home to a country with no work, no mental health system, no support networks, no path back to normal life. This is a politically explosive combination. A traumatized veteran class plus an economy that cannot absorb them, plus a leadership terrified of unrest, is not a country ready for peace. It is a country trapped by the consequences of its own decisions. So let's add this to the equation we've been building. Russia cannot stop the war economically. Its leadership cannot survive stopping it politically. Its propaganda machine cannot justify stopping it ideologically. And its society cannot absorb the consequences of stopping it socially. It is a country that has crossed lines it cannot uncross. And so the war continues, not because it is winnable and not because it serves Russia's future, but because stopping it threatens the foundation of the entire system. What happens next depends on forces larger than Putin alone. Forces outside Russia, forces shaping the global balance of power. And that takes us to the last piece of the puzzle. So after all of this, after tracing the economic trap, the political fear, the propaganda ecosystem, and the underlying imperial ideology, we arrive at the final layer of this story. And it is a crucial one, because the decision to continue this war is not made in a vacuum. It does not exist solely in the mind of Vladimir Putin or in the halls of the Kremlin. It is shaped in a very real way by two external forces, China and the United States. And right now, both of them are dragging this conflict in opposite directions, with Ukraine caught in the middle. Let's start with China, because in many ways, China is the silent architect of the war's durability. Russia is not surviving sanctions alone. It is not sustaining its military production alone. It is not keeping its economy running, its factories equipped, or its oil flowing alone. It is doing that through China. Almost half of Russia's imports now come from China. The machinery needed to produce weapons, CNC, machines, industrial electronics, precision tools, is coming from China. The components that Russia once bought from Europe, Japan, South Korea now arrive through Chinese brokers. Oil once sold to Europe now goes through Chinese refineries or Chinese shipping intermediaries. Even Russia's shadow fleet, those aging tankers with murky flags and murkier owners, depends on Chinese companies for insurance, spare parts, and financing. This is not a partnership of equals. This is dependence so deep that if China decided tomorrow morning to tighten the spigot just a little, not close it entirely, just tighten it, Russia's war machine would grind to a halt within months. So the key question becomes, what does China want? China does not want Russia to win decisively. China does not want Russia to collapse violently. China wants Russia weakened just enough to be permanently dependent, a junior partner, a manageable ally, a counterweight to American power. And above all, China does not want the United States to emerge as the peacemaker in Europe. Now, bring in Donald Trump. We know from reporting inside Washington and from the frantic pace of diplomatic shuttles that the Trump administration has been trying repeatedly to broker a peace deal. We know Trump has sent envoys to Moscow several times. We know he has announced deadlines publicly. We know he believes he can deliver a ceasefire. And we know that, to the White House, securing such a deal would be a defining foreign policy moment. But here is the reality that few people are willing to say out loud. China cannot allow that deal to happen, at least not on American terms. Because the moment the United States brokers peace, Washington becomes the central diplomatic power in Eurasia. America becomes the guarantor of the post-war order. Ukraine becomes anchored to the West. And Russia becomes far less dependent on Beijing. For China, that is unacceptable. And Russia knows it. Putin knows it. His advisors know it. His generals know it. His economists know it. Every Russian official who deals with China understands the same fundamental equation. Russia does not get to choose peace independently anymore. Its economic survival is tied to Beijing. And Beijing's geopolitical interests require a long war, not a catastrophic one, not an existential one, but a long, grinding, unresolved conflict that keeps Russia firmly inside China's sphere of influence. Now, let's add Trump's perspective. For months, Trump has been telling the world he can end the war quickly. He believes genuinely or politically that he can negotiate with Putin directly. And on paper, the incentive is obvious. A U.S. brokered ceasefire would be historic. It would redefine America's role. It would overshadow European diplomacy entirely. It would give Washington enormous leverage in the reconstruction of Ukraine. But Trump's approach has run into two hard realities. First, the Kremlin does not want Trump to get the credit for peace. Peace delivered by Trump, especially a peace structured around Western guarantees, would undermine the core narrative that Putin has built domestically, that Russia is resisting Western domination, not negotiating with it. Second, even if Trump offers a deal that appears favorable, a freeze in place, a demilitarization agreement, security guarantees crafted in Washington, Russia cannot sign it without China's blessing. And China has no interest in blessing it. This is the strategic triangle shaping the endgame of the war. A United States that wants a negotiated ceasefire, a Russia that cannot afford one, and a China that benefits from its impossibility. So where does that leave Ukraine? Ukraine continues to fight for survival, territory, identity, and future. Its army is strained. Its population is exhausted. Its infrastructure is being systematically destroyed. Its economy relies heavily on Western aid. And yet, despite all of this, Ukraine's position in the world has never been clearer. Ukraine has become the central test of 21st century authoritarian power. It has become the front line between two worldviews, one that believes nations can choose their own destiny, and one that believes great powers can dictate it through force. And this brings us back to the question we began with: why does the war continue? After 6 blocks, after thousands of words, after peeling back the ideology, the economy, the propaganda, the fear, and the geopolitics, the answer is this: the war continues because it must. Not for Russia's victory, not for Ukraine's defeat, but for the survival of systems. Russia's political system, Russia's economic model, China's strategic ambitions, and the illusion shared by both Moscow and Beijing that time is on their side. This war persists because peace, at least today, is more dangerous to the Kremlin than war. Because peace would expose the failure of the invasion, the scale of the casualties, the gravity of the economic damage. Because peace would let veterans return home to a country unable to absorb them. Because peace would loosen China's grip and weaken Russia's dependence. Because peace would force accountability, and autocracies do not survive accountability. So the war goes on. And unless one of 3 things happens, a military breakthrough, a systemic collapse, or a profound shift inside Russia's leadership, it will continue. Not because it is winnable, but because for those who hold power in Moscow and those who benefit strategically in Beijing, peace remains the greater threat.